Hey there, my name is Jeremy Siskind. I'm the author of Jazz Piano Fundamentals and Playing Solo Jazz Piano. You can get those books over at my website, jeremysiskind.com, or at amazon.com. And today I want to talk with you about adding chords that aren't written on the lead sheet. If you've observed jazz pianists or really any jazz instrumentalists closely, you'll notice that they're, of course, covering basically the chords that might be written for a standard tune. But then they're often kind of going off script and doing some other things. And I want to describe to you, at least as far as I can figure out, and as far as I teach, what sorts of things these musicians tend to be doing. So that's the plan for today. Let's launch in. Okay, so title is adding in chords that aren't written. And just to be clear, we're not talking about like doing a big old reharmonization of a tune. What we're talking about here is taking a lead sheet, you're at a jam session, you're playing with friends, and you want to add in something other than just the chord. This is especially useful like if you're playing in a jam band, and imagine you're kind of staying on the same chord for 8 bars or 16 bars or 10 minutes in some cases. You want to be able to add some things in. So the first kind of category of ways to add things in, I call tonicization. And the concept of tonicization is that we're creating a 5-to-1 movement. And that one could be a major chord, it could be a minor chord, it could be basically any kind of chord, it could be another dominant chord. But we're basically going to create this feeling that that is momentarily a tonic. So if, we're in C major, and we're just hanging out in C major for however many bars, then we're going to add in a G7. Even if that's not written on the lead sheet, even if the bassist isn't doing it, we can always do that. Listen, I'm not going to go to G in the bass. Now, with all of these devices, it is crucial to resolve back in to the original chord. Otherwise, you're going to have this unresolved dissonant feeling, right? The whole point here is that we're adding a moment of tension and then we're releasing it. If we add in the tension and then don't release the tension, then you can guess what we're left with. We're left with something that just sounds tense and often unintentional. That's a little bit of a tongue twister. So let's see how this works functionally. Let's pretend, I'm using a D minor 7 because so often we're playing a tune like So What, and we have a long D minor 7. So this is my voicing. This is nothing fancy. It's just 3, 5, 7, 9. I'm going to add in an A7. Now, a couple caveats to think about here. The first one is that whenever we have dominant chords, and I've spoken about this a lot on this channel, we are usually going to alter at least one of the color tones. And this is one of the great things about adding in dominant chords with tonicization. So I could play a regular A7, and that sounds okay if I play, for example, G, B, C sharp, and E. That's just fine. But the more altered tones we add to this, I think the happier we're going to be. So let's say we're going to add a flat 9 and a flat 13. And we're going to come up with, I'll just make sure you know that that's an F natural. So technically this would be like an A7. Whoa. Cool. With a flat 9 and flat 13. Super professional as usual. Of course, that's not the only thing that you could add. You could add an A7 with, a sharp 9. Instead of a B flat, we'll go to a C natural. That'll be right up against a C sharp here. So a C sharp and a C natural right next to each other. My writing's really sloppy. I'll clean that up for you. And then let's add a flat 5 instead of a flat 13. It's maybe not the most beautiful voicing ever, but it actually works. You guys also know, if you've studied jazz a while, that we have this rule about the tritone substitution, which is that whenever we have a dominant chord, we can swap it out for a dominant chord, a tritone. That means a augmented fourth or a diminished fifth away. And so frequently, if we're doing this in a solo piano context, instead of thinking about A7, I'm going to go D minor, E flat 7, and add some alterations back to D minor. And the reason is it's just going to be closer by. It's not going to be quite as dramatic as going D, A, D. And then the last thing I want to describe here is that with all of these devices, well, both of the first two big categories I'm going to talk about, we can make a chain of them. So it doesn't have to be just D, A, D. It could be D, and then instead of just A7 to D, let's then tonicize the A7. We're tonicizing the tonicizer, something like that. And in fact, let's just go ahead, let's do one more. Let's tonicize E7. The 5 of E7 would be B7. So now we're going... Or if I was going to do it with bass notes... Now, some of you might be wondering, okay, so if I'm improvising, do I have to do the same thing in the left and the right hand? And the answer is generally we choose to do the same things in the left and right hand as pianists. I think A, it sounds good to match the hands, and B, it's hard to think about doing two different things. But actually, it's kind of interesting to experiment, If I just play D Dorian, right, all those white keys, it's actually cool. Or I could follow those chords. And then I get a lot of other color choices. And in fact, you hear musicians doing this all the time. I'm just going to go back to a simple 1, 5, 1. And now I'm not going to change in my left hand. Right? That's the 3rd, 5th, 7th, flat 9 of the A7. So it's kind of fun. You could change in both hands, change in just the right and keep the left on D minor, or you could change in the left and keep the right on D minor. You've got all these options as you're changing these chords. Before we leave tonicization, I want to show you how it would work in a 2-5-1. So just remember, we always want to aim for the next chord. So the way that I would do this is I would put a D7 here and lead it in to the G7, right? Because D7 is the dominant of G7. That's the 5-to-1 tonicization. So for instance, I'm going to make a D7 with some fun alterations. Okay. And now with this G7, one of the things that we can do to kind of add to this feeling of tonicization is we could add more alterations. So we could go from a G7 to a G7 with more alterations. And you hear how that kind of pushes into the C major? And I'll write that out. I added a flat 9 and a flat 13th. Or the other way that you can think about this, and this is just a mental trick, it doesn't really affect what you're playing. Well, I know you can't see that, can you? Is if you want to think of it as a D flat 7, as a tritone sub, right? That's actually exactly what we're playing. F, A flat, B, and E flat. Those would be the 3, 5, 7, 9 of a D flat 7 chord. So it's just making this 2-5-1 much more colorful instead of just these 3 chords. Now we have 5 chords. And of course, if we wanted to go hog wild and go, that's actually kind of nice. If I like it in this middle spot, if I add a D7 in here. It's actually kind of complicated when I'm doing there. I'm going G7, D7, back to G7, and then to the G7 alt. So it's a lot of motion for just one chord. But it creates movement and this feeling of momentum in your progression without playing out or doing anything fancy. There's only kind of one chord that doesn't belong. Now, the other big category, in my opinion, of these chords that aren't in the original lead sheet that we add is what I call sidestepping. And sidestepping means displacing each of the notes of the chord in the same direction and then resolving in by half steps. So, for example, if I have this same D minor 7 voicing, I have 2 ways that I could sidestep. I could go a half step up to the notes of E flat minor 7 and then resolve down. And you always have to resolve. You can't just add in the chord a half step away. That doesn't work. It's going to be tense. One way you can think about this is as a big neighbor motion. It's just 4 neighbor motions happening at once. Right? Okay. Getting off track. Or I could go below to the notes of a C sharp minor 7. And then resolve. Always resolving. I can't say it enough. Now, for dominant chords, what's kind of interesting is that this is going to actually be really similar. So let's say I'm doing a G7. Here's a nice voicing for a G7, the 7th, the 9th, the 3rd, and the 13th. If I sidestep from above, it's actually exactly the same as tonicization plus tritone sub, right? So there is overlap between these concepts. But if we're going below for a dominant chord, or if we're using it for a minor 7 or major 7 chord, then it will be different than tonicization. So pretty close, pretty similar, but slightly different concepts. So there's 2 side steps, E minor, E flat minor, D minor. Okay. And just like for our tonicization, we can do this in the context of a 2-5-1. And just to keep this interesting, let's sidestep from below into the dominant chord. So this is going to be G flat 7. And by the way, I'm writing out these chord symbols for you. You don't necessarily need to think in terms of chord symbols if you don't want to. You know, you can just think about the shape being displaced by a half step. So I'm using the exact same notes. And I'm showing you this in context again because I have a lot of students who put in a sidestep here, but they put in a sidestep to D minor. And that doesn't work. If you're leading ahead, you need to sidestep the chord that's about to come. Okay? There's a weird shadow on my face this whole time, isn't there? Oh well. If you're watching this, you don't care about production value. I don't know what happened in the middle of this C major chord, but same thing. Let's add a sidestep going downwards to this C major 7. So this is going to be just like a D flat major 7. And I'll tell you what, because we like to have fun here, let's add in one above that. So this will be basically like a D major 7. So how does this sound? Good. So if your ear is like mine, hearing that D major 7, you're kind of like, oh, where's this going? And then by the time you get to that C major, it's like, well, okay, I'll buy it. There's a little sidestep from below. And this isn't to say that you couldn't sidestep in the middle of these bars as well. For example, if we wanted to, we could do a sidestep. Now we have E flat minor, and it's going to return to D minor. So, those double side steps totally work. As I referenced earlier, this is great in jam bands, funk bands, anything that stays on the same chord for quite a while, right? If I'm playing, let's say, G7, you know, if I'm playing in a funk band, this might be my voicing for a G7. I've got B, F, A sharp. It's the 3rd and the 7th and the sharp 9. Now, great funk bands could play that forever, and if the groove is good enough, then we don't need to do anything. But if we want to maybe decorate the beginnings of phrases, then we might do some sidestep. So it might be... Now listen. I messed up. Sidestep from above. It's just my dream to play with Maceo Parker someday. I don't think I will ever achieve that dream. But at least I know that one voicing, and I know how to sidestep. So this is already 17 minutes. I'm going to make a part 2 of this video where I talk about some other ways that are a little bit more specific to certain kinds of chords and certain kinds of progressions. But these 2 ways, tonicization and sidestepping, will get you a really long way if you use them wisely. So, just to conclude, I really appreciate any support of my books, Playing Solo Jazz Piano and Jazz Piano Fundamentals. And stick around for part 2. Keep your eyes out. I'll see y'all soon. Bye-bye.